Temporary duty assignments, or TDYs, often bring an element of adventure and variety to a soldier's routine. Unfortunately, this one offered nothing of the sort. It was a grueling, relentless 30 days filled with backbreaking work and little sleep. Every year, the U.S. Army selects specific units for a rapid deployment exercise, flying them and their equipment overseas to Germany. There, they train with NATO forces in an intense month-long operation meant to simulate wartime conditions. At that time, I was Captain James Carter, a relatively inexperienced officer assigned to the Operations Division at Fort Ridge, Texas. This deployment couldn't have come at a more inconvenient moment. My wife, Clara, was heavily pregnant, with her due date set to fall right in the middle of the exercise. We had been married for nearly 6 years, and this was supposed to be a time of excitement and anticipation. Instead, I was boarding a plane, weighed down by the knowledge that I might miss the birth of my first child. My commanding officer, likely sensing my unease, tried to offer reassurance. "Captain Carter, I promise you, I'll do whatever it takes to get you home in time." That's my word. At the time, I believed him. When the exercise concluded, I wasted no time. My gear was packed in minutes, and I made my way to the transport vehicle heading for the airport. Before departing, I called Clara to let her know I was on my way. She sounded distressed. "James, I think I might need to be hospitalized soon. It could be any day now." "Perfect timing," I replied, trying to sound optimistic. "I'll be there before you know it." The sun was just beginning to set as we drove down the highway toward the airport. Out of nowhere, a deer appeared in front of the vehicle. The driver swerved to avoid it, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital bed. The sterile white walls and the weight of the 4 in my arm made it clear I wasn't in Texas anymore. A nurse explained that I was in a military hospital in Frankfurt. My injuries were extensive: a broken arm, a shattered leg, 3 cracked ribs, and a collapsed lung. I struggled to process the information. "How long have I been here?" I managed to croak. "5 days, sir," she replied. "Has my wife been contacted? Is she here?" "No, sir. She has not been notified yet." I didn't wait for permission. I grabbed the phone and dialed Clara. The moment she answered, her concern was palpable. "James, are you okay?" "Don't worry about me," I said quickly. "How are you? How's the baby?" There was a long silence on the other end. Then, through broken sobs, she said, "We lost her, James. The baby didn't make it." Her words hit me harder than any of my injuries. I swallowed hard, trying to stay composed. "And you? Are you all right?" "Physically, I'm fine. But emotionally, I don't know how to handle this." 2 weeks later, I was flown back home on a medical transport. Clara met me at the airfield and accompanied me to the hospital at Fort Ridge. Her face bore the weight of grief, and her attempts to comfort me felt hollow. We were both drowning in our own despair. I stayed in the hospital for another 2 weeks before being cleared for limited duty. Life carried on. 2 years later, I received orders transferring us to Badenheim, Germany. The change of scenery seemed to help. We spent 3 years there, exploring Europe and trying to move past the tragedy. During that time, I earned a promotion to major, and when our assignment ended, we were relocated to Camp Evergreen, Washington. There, we were granted spacious field-grade officer housing, complete with a garage, an upgrade that felt like a small reward for years of sacrifice. When we moved in, all the items we had shipped to Germany were returned, along with the boxes we had left behind in storage. One afternoon, as I sorted through the chaos of unpacking, I came across something unusual. Buried among the old boxes was a small wooden chest I didn't recognize. Intrigued, I set it aside and opened it. What I found inside shook me to my core. Inside the chest was a collection of envelopes bound together with a pink ribbon. My curiosity quickly turned to dread as I opened the first one. It contained a birth certificate. My eyes scanned the document, and my chest tightened as I read the details. A baby girl had been born alive, weighing 7 pounds, 6 ounces, and measuring 19 inches long. The date on the certificate was the same day Clara had told me our child had been stillborn. The name listed was Grace, my daughter's name, but the line for the father's name read, "Unknown." My hands trembled as I opened the next envelope. It was an adoption certificate. As I read the document, the truth became undeniable. Clara had given up our daughter for adoption without my knowledge or consent. Since I was listed as unknown, my permission hadn't been required. I felt sick. Clara hadn't just lied. She had stolen my child from me. How many secrets had she been keeping? How many other betrayals had there been? She had always demanded space in our marriage, claiming it was healthy to keep parts of ourselves private. But this wasn't privacy. This was treachery. Overwhelmed, I needed to think. I got in the car and drove aimlessly until I found myself at a nearby golf course. I went into the clubhouse diner and ordered an old favorite, corned beef hash with 2 eggs. It was a meal I hadn't eaten in years, not since Clara had imposed her strict, joyless dietary rules on me. The food was comforting, but my appetite was gone. All I could think about was what I had just discovered. My life had been a lie, and Clara was the one who had written it. I sat on the deck outside the golf course diner, staring blankly at the horizon as golfers finished the 18th hole and filed into the clubhouse. My thoughts churned with anger, betrayal, and a crushing sense of loss. How had my life turned into this? When I finally mustered the energy to return home, it was midday. Clara had made significant progress unpacking boxes and organizing the house, but her efforts now felt like a cruel joke, a facade of a shared life built on lies. I left without saying much and headed to my unit's office, hoping that work might distract me. The office was practically empty except for the officer on duty. I sat at my desk, staring at the paperwork in front of me, but my mind was elsewhere. The thought of Grace, my daughter, who I hadn't even known existed, kept pulling me back into a storm of emotions. I barely noticed the hours passing until I realized it was past midnight. When I finally got home, Clara was in bed, reading as if nothing was wrong. I quietly undressed, took a shower, and emerged with a decision already made. I'll sleep downstairs, I announced flatly as I left the room, closing the door behind me. I had just turned on the TV and was settling on the couch when Clara appeared, her face etched with frustration. She grabbed the remote, turned off the TV, and stood in front of me with her arms crossed. "Cut the crap," she snapped. "Tell me what's wrong. Either let me help you or tell me to leave. What's it going to be? I haven't done anything wrong, and I'm not going to stand here and be yelled at or shoved aside while you sulk." I stood up, walked over to her, and calmly took the remote from her hand. Without a word, I turned the TV back on. "Have a safe trip," I said coldly, brushing past her. My tone made it clear that I wasn't interested in discussing anything further. She stormed off, leaving less than an hour later. By Monday morning, I had made up my mind. I went straight to my commander's office and laid everything out for him, showing him the documents I'd found. He sat in stunned silence as he listened. "What do you plan to do?" he finally asked. "I don't know yet," I admitted. She didn't say where she was going, and she didn't take everything, especially the box. He sighed, his expression grim. "James, finding your daughter, if she's yours, will be nearly impossible. Adoption records are sealed for a reason, to protect both parties." "I understand that, sir," I replied, "but I can't sit here and do nothing. I don't trust her to tell me the truth anymore." Then, like a bolt of lightning, an idea struck me. "Wait, I might have a lead. Sir, can I have the day off?" He nodded. "Go. Do what you need to do." I saluted and bolted out of the building, barely registering my surroundings as I sped home. Once there, I opened the box again and carefully examined its contents. A small pacifier caught my eye, and a thought struck me. This might hold the key. I placed the pacifier in a clear plastic bag and sealed it. Then, I rummaged through Clara's bathroom drawers. Most of her things were gone, but I found an old hairbrush she had left behind. I bagged it as well and drove to a DNA testing center I had found online. At the lab in downtown Seattle, I handed over the samples and explained what I needed. "It'll take about 3 weeks," the technician told me. I nodded and left, feeling both anxious and determined. Clara didn't call me for another day. When she did, her tone was as biting as ever. "Hi," I said flatly when I answered. "Feeling better?" she asked sarcastically. "Better than what? Better than the idiot I was a couple of days ago?" "No, same idiot. I replied, my voice dripping with mockery. Why? 3 weeks, James, she shot back. By then, I'll decide whether to liquidate you or just divorce you. I ended the call without another word. When I pulled into the driveway the next evening, Clara was already waiting for me, her face red with fury. What do you mean? Liquidate or divorce? What the hell is that supposed to mean? Exactly what it sounds like, I said coldly, stepping out of the car. I deserve an explanation, she demanded. So do I shot back, cutting her off. But you seem to think you don't owe me one. Her expression shifted, the realization dawning on her. Oh my God, no. Please, no. I wasn't moved. I'll be back in an hour. By then, I expect you, and all your things, out of this house. James, please. Don't make me repeat myself. When I returned an hour later, Clara was gone, and with her, the box containing the damning documents. She had taken most of the furniture, too, leaving behind only my favorite chair and an old bedroom set. The house felt empty in more ways than one. The next morning, I began the necessary steps to rebuild my life. I contacted Post Housing to arrange for temporary government furniture. Then I called the credit union, our stockbroker, the insurance company, anyone I could think of to start untangling the mess. Finally, I scheduled an appointment with a JAG officer. They couldn't represent me in court, but they confirmed my suspicions. Clara would get half of everything. Thankfully, we hadn't bought a house, but our financial assets were substantial, and I knew the battle ahead would be costly. For the next few weeks, I focused on routine. I went to work, mowed the lawn, washed the car, and tried to keep my mind off everything. Then one morning the phone rang. Hello? I answered. Is this Major James Carter? A woman's voice asked. Yes, it is. This is Margie from the DNA Analysis Center. Your test results are ready. Can you tell me now? I asked eagerly. I'm sorry, sir, but we can only release results in person or by mail to the verified address you provided. I'll be there as soon as I can. When I arrived, Margie greeted me and asked for my ID before leading me to a small room. Sample A is yours, she began. Sample B is from the hairbrush you provided, and Sample C is from the pacifier. I held my breath as she continued. Samples B and C are positively related, but Sample A is not related to either. Relief and heartbreak hit me simultaneously. Grace wasn't my daughter. At least she wasn't calling someone else daddy, but someone out there was, and Clara had ensured I would never know the full truth. The next day, I met with an attorney, a retired JAG officer. He had no patience for cheating spouses. I knew I had found the right man for the fight ahead. I spent over an hour in the attorney's office, unraveling the tangled mess of lies and betrayal that had become my life. He listened intently, asking pointed questions only when necessary. And by the end, he had a clear picture of my situation. We'll fight this, he said firmly. His confidence gave me a flicker of hope, but the emotional weight of everything still pressed heavily on my shoulders. When I got home that evening, there was a letter in the mailbox. The handwriting was unmistakable, Clara's. I opened it to find a single line. Fred, 3 weeks are up. Clara. Short and cold, it sent a clear message. The return address was her parents' home in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. I called her immediately. Hi, Fred, she answered, her voice annoyingly casual. We need to talk, I said sharply. I won't discuss this over the phone, and I'm certainly not flying to Pennsylvania, I snapped. So, if you want to talk, you'll have to come here. If you mean Seattle, I'm already here, she replied coolly. I sent that letter last week. I'll be at the house at 6:30. Come over then. She hung up before I could respond. I made no effort to prepare for her arrival. No coffee, no snacks, this wasn't a social call. I laid the DNA test results, the birth certificate, and the adoption papers on the government-issued coffee table, their presence a silent declaration of war. Clara pulled into the driveway at 6:20, but didn't ring the bell until precisely 6:30. True to form, she was as calculated as ever. I took my time answering the door, savoring her discomfort. Come in, I said, my tone devoid of warmth. I gestured toward a stiff, uncomfortable chair, making it clear where I wanted her to sit. I settled on the couch, leaning back with deliberate calm. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out the pacifier and held it out to her. She snatched it from my hand, clutching it to her chest as though it were a lifeline. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion, as if I'd handed her the world. Next, I handed her a copy of the DNA results. "You already know I'm not the father, but now you have official confirmation," I said flatly. She reached for the paper with her free hand, the pacifier still clutched tightly in the other. "Your sample A, I assume?" she asked quietly. I nodded. Without another word, I slid the rest of the documents toward her. She leaned forward, her eyes scanning the title on the top sheet. Tears filled her eyes as she read the dissolution of marriage application. She tried to continue, but her tears fell freely onto the paper, forcing her to set it down. "Do you have a tissue?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "No. Irraplia curli. I didn't think you'd need one." "You're not making this easy for me," she said, her voice breaking. "You cheated," I replied bluntly. She nodded, unable to argue. "How many times?" I demanded. "Does it matter?" "No," I admitted. "I just want to know." "Once," she said after a long pause. "One weekend. Different men. Just one." "Who?" I pressed. "Who is he?" "It doesn't matter." "It does to me. I'm not going to tell you." "Do I know him?" Her silence was answer enough. "So you'd rather protect him than save your marriage," I said coldly. She picked up the divorce petition, her hands trembling. "Our marriage is already over. Why ruin it any further? Then tell me this. Why did you lie about our daughter? Why did you say she didn't survive?" She inhaled sharply, as though the weight of her secrets had finally become too much to bear. "When I found out I was pregnant, I didn't know if she was yours or his," she began, her voice shaking. "I considered not having her, but I couldn't go through with it. As time passed, I told myself you'd never know. I thought that if she was a girl, it'd be easier to hide. A bond between a father and daughter isn't always as obvious." She paused, struggling to continue. "When she was born, she was perfect. She had blonde hair and blue eyes, just like her father. You have brown hair and brown eyes. No one in our families looks like that. I knew you'd see it immediately. I had to make a choice." Her words hit me like a blow to the chest. "And you chose to give her away," I said, my voice ice cold. "I chose you," she whispered. "You were my husband. I loved you both, but I couldn't have both." "Love," I spat. "You call this love?" She flinched but pressed on. "The hospital staff helped me. I told them I wanted to give her up for adoption, and they brought me the papers within 24 hours. When they asked who the father was, I said I didn't know. It made everything easier that way." She broke down completely, her sobs racking her body. "I lied to you because I didn't know what else to do. I told you she didn't survive. I thought you'd never find out." I stared at her, my anger boiling over. "You thought wrong." Clara clutched the pacifier tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I loved her," she sobbed. "I still do. Every year on her birthday, I take out her birth certificate, her little footprints, and this pacifier. It's all I have left of her." "Not anymore," I said coldly. Her head shot up, her face pale. "What do you mean?" "They scraped the milk off the pacifier at the DNA lab." She let out a guttural cry and collapsed to the floor, curling into a ball. I watched her without moving, my heart hardened against her despair. Eventually, I picked her up and placed her on the couch, covering her with a blanket. I couldn't let her leave in this state, not yet. At midnight, I heard the toilet flush. When I came downstairs, she was sitting on the couch, her face puffy and pale. "Would you like some coffee?" I asked, my tone neutral. "Yes, please," she whispered. I poured her a cup and handed it to her. "Where are you staying?" I asked after a long silence. "At a motel," she replied. "I stay with my parents most of the time." "Do they know the truth?" "No," she admitted. "I lied to them too. I told them we were going through a rough patch, and I needed to get away. And they believed you," I said bitterly. Clara said nothing, her silence speaking louder than any words could. "They think I came back to try and work things out with you," Clara muttered, her voice hollow as she stared at her empty coffee cup. Without another word, she got up, walked over to the coffee table, and pulled a pen from her purse. Sitting down, she signed the divorce papers without hesitation or even reading them. Then, Just as quietly as she arrived, she left. I didn't feel relief or satisfaction as I watched her go. Just emptiness. The next morning, I took the signed papers to my attorney. "It's done," I said as I handed them over. He nodded, and within the hour, the paperwork was filed. Despite the closure, I couldn't stop thinking about one lingering mystery: the man Clara had cheated with. She never told me his name or how their affair started. The betrayal wasn't just about the act. It was her continued defense of this unknown man, her refusal to name him, her willingness to protect him even as our marriage fell apart. That cut deeper than the infidelity itself. Her insistence that it only lasted one weekend offered little comfort. My thoughts spiraled every time I considered who he might be. Was he a colleague? A friend? A stranger she met on a whim? Questions without answers haunted me, but work kept me too busy to dwell on them for long. 2 weeks later, I was attending a seminar back at Fort Hood, where Clara and I had been stationed when her daughter, not mine, I reminded myself, was born. The atmosphere of the seminar was surprisingly relaxed, and we were split into small groups for a project. My group consisted of me, a major from Alaska named Keith Franklin, and a civilian contractor who mostly kept to himself. Keith and I hit it off almost immediately. Despite being stationed at Fort Wright, the coldest base in the Army, he had an easygoing charm and a quick wit. He was also a genius with computers, and together we completed our project far ahead of schedule, leaving us with plenty of time to talk. Over lunch at the officers' club, Keith shared his story. He admitted he had cheated on his wife, leading to a bitter divorce. "She's remarried now," he said with a bitter laugh. "My kids call the new guy Dad. It's tough, but I brought it on myself." Something about his honesty prompted me to share my own story. I told him about Clara, the affair, the lies, and the daughter I'd only discovered through DNA testing. When I finished, Keith stared at me with a strange look in his eyes. "You don't know who the guy was?" he asked. "No," I admitted. "She wouldn't tell me. It happened here at Hood about 6 years ago. All I know is that he had blonde hair and blue eyes." Keith leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative. "Come with me," he said abruptly, standing up. I followed him out of the club and across the base to the Manpower Center, where every person assigned to Fort Hood had to go through processing. Keith walked straight into the HR director's office, where a cheerful older woman immediately stood up to greet him. "Keith Franklin, what are you doing here?" she exclaimed, pulling him into a warm hug. "Aunt Lucy," he said with a grin. "I need your help." Her desk nameplate read Mrs. Healy, but she smiled at me and said, "Call me Aunt Lucy. Everyone does." Keith wasted no time. "Aunt Lucy, do you remember a blonde-haired, blue-eyed officer who might have been stationed here about 6 years ago?" She tilted her head thoughtfully. "Blonde and blue-eyed? That's all you've got?" "Pretty much," Keith admitted. She laughed. "Keith, do you know how many people come through here in a year? Let alone 6 years ago? I might have seen him, but I don't remember every face." Keith turned to me. "Fred, tell her when you were here." "About 6 years ago," I said. "My wife and I were stationed here at the time." Lucy's eyes lit up. "Fred Sadler? I remember that name. You and your wife were here around the time of the rapid deployment exercises, right?" "Yes," I replied, surprised. "How do you remember that?" "She has Sam," Keith explained. "So?" I asked. "Supreme autobiographical memory," Lucy clarified with a smile. "It means I can remember almost everything I've experienced, faces, names, events. It's a blessing and a curse." "Or just a curse," Keith teased. Lucy chuckled. "It's why I've been here so long. They call me Fort Hood's institutional memory." "Unfortunately," Keith added with a grin. "Okay, so you remember everything," I said. "Does that include anyone who might fit this description?" She thought for a moment, then shook her head. "I don't recall any blonde-haired, blue-eyed officers around that time. But give me a day or two to ask around. If he was here, I'll find him." 2 days later, Lucy called Keith with an update. "I've narrowed it down," she said. "There weren't any officers who fit the description, but there was a civilian who worked for the Office of Post Engineers, Kurt Weber. He's been here about 10 years now. Used to head the plumbing department before moving into new construction." Keith relayed the information to me, and my gut churned. I needed to meet this Weber guy to find out if he was the one and if he was make him understand what he'd done. The next morning, I parked my rental car on the street near Weber's house, waiting to see if he'd leave. Hours passed before his garage door finally opened, and a car sped down the street. I started my engine, ready to follow him and confront the man who had helped shatter my life. Thank God, I thought as Weber's car pulled out of the driveway. I hadn't been looking forward to sitting there all day like some amateur detective, but I'd been prepared to wait as long as necessary. I followed him at a safe distance, watching as he drove to a Home Depot. We both parked, and I tailed him into the store. It was clear Weber was a regular. He greeted a few employees like old friends and sauntered over to a coffee station near the entrance, a perk for their contractor customers. He poured himself a cup, added cream, and leaned casually against the counter, chewing gum obnoxiously with his mouth open. I cringed, as if physically engaging with my wife and fathering her child wasn't repulsive enough. He had to chew gum like a Neanderthal. Weber's conversation with a clerk ended when the clerk went to assist another customer. Taking a final sip of his coffee, Weber spat his gum into the paper cup, unwrapped another piece, and walked away. The cup, gum still inside, was left on top of a nearby trash can. I glanced around, saw no one watching, and grabbed the cup. Slipping it into a plastic bag, I hurried back to my car and called Keith. "I've got something," I told him, explaining what I'd retrieved. Keith laughed. "You're not going to believe this, but I might have something bigger. Get back here as soon as you can." When I arrived at the base, Keith was practically bouncing on his feet, clutching a stack of papers. "You're not going to believe this," he exclaimed, his excitement infectious. "No, seriously, you'd better sit down." I did as he said, and he thrust the papers in front of me. "Look at this," he said, his voice brimming with pride. Scanning the documents, I saw names and an address. Confused, I looked up. "So what?" Keith's grin widened. "That's Hope's name and address." "Well, her name is Sarah Randolph now." My heart stopped. "How did you find this?" Keith leaned in, his excitement uncontainable. "I hacked into the adoption agency's records." "You hacked?" I began, stunned. "Well, technically my brother did, but same difference. These files are encrypted better than nuclear codes, but we cracked them." I let out a laugh, both impressed and horrified. "That's great, Keith, but what am I supposed to do with this?" Keith shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe blackmail someone." I gave him a look of mock exasperation. "Blackmail a 6-year-old? Yeah, sounds like a great idea. 2 Army officers charged with threatening a foster child. That'll look amazing on our resumes." We both laughed, but I couldn't shake the weight of what I now held. I had her name, her address, her life, at least on paper. What was I supposed to do with it? That Sunday, I found myself driving to the address Keith had uncovered, almost 200 miles away in Corsicana. I parked a short distance from the house, a typical suburban home with a neat lawn and a mailbox out front. For over an hour, I sat in my car, observing the quiet rhythms of an average American neighborhood. Children played, neighbors chatted, and lawnmowers hummed in the distance. At noon, a car pulled into the driveway. A man was driving, a woman sat in the passenger seat, and a little girl occupied the rear seat. I grabbed my phone, ready to capture the moment. The woman got out first, opened the back door, and helped the child out of her car seat. She knelt to straighten the girl's dress, and I snapped a few quick photos. Just then, I heard a noise beside my car. A mother and child were walking past, chatting casually. The little girl next to my car squealed, "Sarah," and ran toward the child who had just exited the car, my daughter Hope. I froze, heart pounding, as they embraced just feet away from me. I took a few more pictures before starting my car and driving off, unwilling to risk drawing attention to myself. A few blocks away, I stopped and reviewed the photos. They were perfect. In one, Hope's bright blue eyes shone like Clara's description of her newborn. I had proof. The following week, Keith and I graduated from our seminar. We celebrated with dinner and drinks before parting ways. Him back to Alaska, and me to Seattle. On Monday, I returned to the DNA lab with the cup and gum. The technician didn't recognize me at first, but when I mentioned the pacifier, she remembered. I handed her the new sample and told her I'd be back in 3 weeks. 2 weeks later, she called. It's a match, she said. The samples confirm a mother, father, and child. I thanked her and hung up. The confirmation weighed heavily on me. Weber was Hope's biological father. I didn't know what to do with the information, but I acted anyway. I purchased envelopes and paper, made copies of the DNA results and photos, and carefully sanitized everything to remove any trace of my identity. Wearing gloves, I sealed the envelope, addressed it to Mrs. Kurt Weber, and included Lydia's name and her parents' address. I drove to Seattle's main post office and dropped it in the mailbox. A month later, Aunt Lucy called me. "Fred, I need complete honesty. Did you and Keith set Kurt Weber up?" I sighed. "Aunt Lucy, Keith had nothing to do with it. I sent something to Weber's wife. DNA results, pictures of Hope, that sort of thing." "Well, you stirred up quite the hornet's nest. His wife tested his DNA herself, and it matched the profiles. Now she knows about the affair, and their marriage is over. Weber's been losing it all over the base." Her tone softened. "It's a mess, Fred, but maybe it needed to happen. I just hope his family makes it through okay." "It was already over for me," I said. "Lydia and I are divorced. Now Weber's facing the same." Over the next 2 years, life gradually moved on. I went on a few dates, bought a house, and resumed some semblance of normalcy. Returning to Fort Hood for a new assignment, I found myself face-to-face with a familiar voice. "Major Carter? Back again?" It was now Lieutenant Colonel Keith Franklin. We shook hands, laughing as if no time had passed. He had requested me as his assistant, and we quickly fell back into old camaraderie. For the first time in years, I felt like the pieces of my life were finally falling into place. That evening, as I settled into my new house with a beer and a slice of pizza, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find a woman standing on the porch, her expression unreadable. My new beginning had arrived. Unexpected, but perhaps just what I needed. "Hi, neighbor," the woman on my porch said with a warm smile. "I'm Samantha Randolph, but everyone calls me Sammy. My family and I live just down the street. We're new to the neighborhood too, so I wanted to introduce myself. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Her tone was cheerful, but her eyes scanned the sparse interior of my house through the open door. "Is your wife here?" I smiled politely. "Fred Sadler. No wife, divorced." Her smile faltered for a moment, but I quickly added, "Don't worry, I don't throw loud wild parties, or even quiet wild ones." That earned a laugh. We chatted for a few more minutes before she excused herself. I couldn't shake the thought that her friendliness was genuine, but tinged with curiosity. The first week in my new home passed quickly. On Saturday morning, my doorbell rang, and I opened it to find Sammy standing there with 2 other women, all carrying food. They wasted no time inviting themselves in, commenting on how barren my house looked. Sammy took the lead, declaring it was their mission to help me furnish and decorate. I barely had time to protest before they set to work. Within hours, I had a slightly worn but comfortable leather couch, a dining table with chairs, and a small coffee table. It wasn't much, but it turned my house from a bachelor cave into a livable space. As the women were about to leave, the door burst open, and 3 children barreled in, laughing and chasing each other. One of the women, Ruth, scooped up 2 of them, while Sammy caught the third. "Calm down, Sarah," she said gently, kneeling to brush the girl's blonde hair away from her piercing blue eyes. "This is our new neighbor, Major Sadler." Sarah turned to me with a confident smile. "Hello, my name is Sarah." "Hi, Sarah," I said, crouching to her level. "How old are you?" "I'll be 7 soon," she said proudly. I straightened, my mind racing. Blonde hair, blue eyes, 7 years old. It couldn't be. After they left, I went straight to my den, pulled out the folder I'd kept hidden, and opened it. My hands trembled as I compared the pictures I'd taken years ago to the girl I had just met. There was no doubt. Sarah Randolph was my daughter, Hope. Over the next few weeks, Sammy and her friends took it upon themselves to finish decorating my house. They even hosted a neighborhood open house once it was complete. Sammy introduced me to her sister-in-law, Joni Payne, who was recently divorced. We hit it off immediately, and by the end of the night, I was already planning to call her. Joni and I quickly became inseparable. Our first date led to many more, and before long, We were spending most of our time together. One evening, as we sat in the backyard watching Sarah play in the sandbox, I decided to broach the topic that had been haunting me. "She's a beautiful child, isn't she?" I said, nodding towards Sarah. "She really is," Joni replied, not taking her eyes off her. "Did you know she was adopted?" Joni looked at me, surprised. "Really?" I nodded. "Dwight and Sammy have had her since birth. According to the adoption agency, her birth mother was married but had an affair and got pregnant. She didn't want her husband to find out, so she gave the baby up. The agency keeps the records sealed tight." "What was her name before?" Joni asked. "Hope," I said softly. "Her birth mother named her that." Joni moved in with me 7 months later, and a year after that, we were married. Life felt full and happy, but the Army had other plans. Orders came in for a 3-year deployment to Germany. We embraced the opportunity, though it meant fewer visits to the States. When we returned for a family reunion, Sarah was at camp. During our next visit, she was almost 18 and had decided to find her biological parents. Dwight and Sammy supported her, but the adoption agency wouldn't help. Frustrated, they turned to a DNA testing service, hoping to find answers that way. That night, Joni and I lay in bed, discussing the news. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice quiet. "About what?" "About Sarah," she said. "Fred, married couples shouldn't have secrets. I know about your file. I found it 6 months after we got married." I sat up, stunned. You knew?" She nodded. "I didn't say anything because I figured it wasn't my place. But now it's important. Sarah deserves answers." I sighed heavily. "What do you think I should do?" "Tell the story. Let Dwight and Sammy decide how to handle it." The next morning, we asked Sarah to spend the day with her friends so we could talk to Dwight and Sammy privately. When we told them everything, their reactions were mixed. Dwight listened calmly, nodding occasionally, while Sammy's face betrayed a whirlwind of emotions. "This is a lot to process," Dwight finally said. "But it makes sense. Thank you for telling us." Sammy, however, remained silent, her expression unreadable. A week later, Sammy called me. "Fred, I want to say thank you," she began, "for being honest with us. Sarah deserves to know where she comes from. I just want what's best for her," I said sincerely. "We'll tell her soon. But first, Dwight and I need to figure out how." That night, as I lay in bed with Joni, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, the weight of secrecy had lifted. Sarah's journey to the truth was just beginning, but mine had finally reached a place of peace. The next morning, Sarah was picked up by her best friend for a trip to the mall, giving us the perfect opportunity for an important conversation. Dwight, Sammy, Joni, and I gathered around the kitchen table. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what I was about to say. "I want to start by saying that Joni and I packed our bags this morning. If, after hearing what I have to say, you want us to leave, we're ready." Joni nodded beside me, showing her quiet support. Dwight and Sammy exchanged a concerned glance, but said nothing. I continued. "Sarah doesn't need to send in her DNA to find her biological parents. I already know who they are." The looks on their faces ranged from shock to curiosity. I took another deep breath and launched into the full story, from Lydia's betrayal, to Hope's adoption, to how I discovered Sarah's identity. When I finished, the room was thick with silence. Sammy was the first to react. She stood, walked over to me, and pulled me into a tight hug. "Oh, poor guy," she murmured, "living with that all these years and not being able to talk about it. No one deserves that." She hugged me again, her tears dampening my shirt. "What do you think, Dwight?" she asked, returning to her seat. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "I'm trying to calculate the odds of how we all ended up together," he said finally. "I don't think there's a big enough number." "So, what do we do now?" Sammy asked, her voice steady but soft. "I think Fred should contact his ex-wife and invite her to Sarah's graduation," Joni suggested. "Why me?" I protested. "Because you started this," Dwight replied with a grin. "But who's going to contact Weber?" "Not me," I said firmly, recounting the last time I saw him. "You never told me that," Joni said, turning to me. "I didn't think you knew the whole story," I admitted. She leaned over and kissed me on the cheek. "I love this man," she said with a soft laugh. and I felt a rush of gratitude for her unwavering support. Later that day, when Sarah returned, Dwight and Sammy sat her down and shared the story. Her reaction mirrored their own, shock, nervousness, but also excitement. "I want to keep going," she said, her voice trembling with both fear and hope. "The only way I knew to contact Lydia was through her parents. If they were still alive, still in Mechanicsburg, and still had a landline, it might work." Early Monday morning, I hired a private investigator. Within 2 hours, he had their phone number. Finding Kurt Weber took much longer. I called Lydia's parents and, after reminding them who I was, explained that I needed to speak to her. They took my number, and within the hour, my phone rang. "This is Lydia Bowman," said a voice I hadn't heard in years. "I was told to call you." Lydia. It's Fred." "Fred. Wow, it's been a long time. How are you?" "I'm doing well," I replied. "Lydia, I need to talk to you about something important." "Okay," she said, her tone growing cautious. "Go ahead." "Not over the phone. This needs to happen in person. Fred, we haven't spoken in years. And now you have something so important it can't be discussed over the phone? I'm sorry, but I'm not buying it." "Fine," I said sharply. "But remember, I gave you a chance." "A chance for what?" "Come on, Fred. Just tell me what's going on." "Only in person," I said firmly. "Call me if you change your mind." Wait. "Okay, fine. We live in Vegas now." "Good. I'll fly out tomorrow and call you when I land." The next day, we met in the lobby of the Bellagio Hotel. Lydia had brought her husband, Roland Bowman, along. "Anything you have to say, you can say in front of Roland," she said coldly. "Fine," I said, leading us to a quiet corner. I ordered wine for the three of us, and after a sip, I dropped the bombshell. "Her name is Sarah. She's graduating in 2 weeks and wants you to be there." Lydia went pale, the wine glass trembling in her hand. She fainted, and Roland quickly caught her, setting her glass down before reviving her. "What did you say?" she whispered when she came to. I repeated myself and pulled out a picture of Sarah. Lydia's tears spilled as she gently touched the photo. "She's beautiful. Where did you get this?" "I took it," I replied. "Yesterday, in her living room." "You took it?" Lydia asked, her voice breaking. "How? Why?" I told her the entire story, from beginning to end. She sat in stunned silence, occasionally glancing at Roland for support. Her initial shock turned to anger. "Why didn't you ever tell me? Why did you keep her from me all these years?" Roland's firm voice interrupted her. "Lydia, you gave up all rights to her. Fred isn't breaking the law by doing this, so calm down." She nodded, taking a deep breath. "When can I see her?" "At her graduation," I said. "If you want to come." "Of course I'll come," she said eagerly. "Can I see her sooner?" "You both need time to process this," I said. "Take it slow. Maybe the day before?" She smiled through her tears. "That would be wonderful." Before we parted, I took a picture of Lydia to show Sarah. She hugged me tightly and kissed my cheek, her emotions overflowing. "Oh, non, je could. She's not exactly subtle, is she?" Back home, I showed Sarah the picture of Lydia. "She's beautiful," Sarah whispered. Her hands trembled as she held the photo. For the first time since I'd known her, she hugged me. "Thank you, Uncle Fred. You get your beauty from her," Sammy said, pulling Sarah into her arms. "Do you know what my birth father looks like?" Sarah asked timidly. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to me. After a pause, I said, "You got your blonde hair and blue eyes from him." Everyone breathed a sigh of relief at my careful answer. A week before the graduation, I received a call from the investigator. "Weber's trail ends overseas," he said. He took a consulting job with a Middle Eastern government and disappeared shortly after arriving. No one's seen him since. When the day finally came, I met Lydia and Roland at the airport and drove them to Sarah's house. Sarah stood in the middle of the living room, her nervous excitement palpable. Lydia walked toward her slowly, tears already streaming. "I brought you something," Lydia said softly, pulling out a pacifier. "It's yours. I thought you might want it back."